Hello everybody, this is Fun Police, and it has been a while since Steel Division 2 has gotten any new content updates for it. Essentially, after the last DLC tribute to Normandy 44 came out, the game had pretty much went on a hiatus as it just really didn't seem much of anything changed. However, that has definitely been altered as the new DLC of the Nemesis Hell's Highway has come out, and with it has been an absolutely massive patch that pretty much is hitting every single division in the game in one way or the other. Today, I'm going to be just going through and summarizing many of the most notable changes, some of them potentially redefining how divisions work or making units that were previously really bad potentially really good. Now, I do need to note that I'm not going to be going through every single change that is in this DLC, because if I did, there would be essentially like an hour and a half of me telling you this bomber went down by 5 points, this AT gun went down by 5 points, and etc. We're mostly going to be looking at the more notable changes, like specific new units and divisions, certain health buffs or performance buffs to weapons and units, on top of other things such as that. If you enjoyed today's content, make sure to like and subscribe, as I do some Steel Division 2 content here or there. And I may even make one on the two new divisions from Hell's Highway. We'll see about that, but anyway, let's go ahead and just go right into talking about the changes. Let's kick this off by talking about Stukas, which have been on screen. Stukas have received a pretty notable change of having a health buff from 6 to 9, essentially taking them to medium resilience, and this applies for all Stuka variants in the game. This is a pretty significant change, as Stukas have pretty much forever always been seen as unable to really get through enemy anti-air, or being very fragile to make use of, especially as the bomber variants have to do this weird dive in order to get their bombs off, making them slow to do it. Now that has been changed, and they are overall going to be at least more reliable in getting their payloads off, if not being able to survive enemy anti-air and whatnot, meaning that a lot of these Stukas will potentially be a lot better. Keep in mind that bombers like the anti-tank Stukas are already seen as quite solid units, with things like the G1, the G2, and the cluster bomber variants all being relatively valuable units. I expect that probably you'll see a lot more Stukas going forward. Another fairly universal change is this series of buffs to submachine guns. The patch notes just list it as lesser SMGs getting a boost in fire rate, with a special note that the MP40 got a particular accuracy bonus. And in fact, this seemingly was strong enough that Strum Pioneers, which were previously 20 points, are now at 25 points. But overall, the intention seems to be trying to make a lot of the weaker SMGs more on par with at least one another, or closer to the good ones like the PPSH 41 and similar. I assume that MP40s, Stens, the MP28, and many of those other submachine guns probably were the ones getting these buffs. Speaking of which, I'll also note that the MG08 got a firepower boost, which doesn't appear on a lot of units, but for the crappy Axis divisions that do have to deal with squads with this, it is a nice little fire rate boost, which, you know, you can't really complain about. On top of that, as said, the Sten probably got a buff as well, which is definitely worthwhile because Stens were previously really bad, and I'm sure that it just helps the British or Commonwealth divisions to have a bit more close-range firepower. Anti-tank rifle teams have pretty much across the board seen availability buffs. This is most notable because their greater numbers allows them to be better at dealing with things like half-tracks and light armored cars. But this includes the PZB-39, the PTRS for the Soviets, the Solothurn that is found in a variety of divisions. Pretty much, if it's an AT rifle team that you find in the AT tab, it's gotten at least 3 or 4 more squads. In some cases, it has even like doubled in certain circumstances. And overall, this will probably be most notable in 1v1s, where the ability to deal with half-tracks can be very important, and these guys being more numerous makes them more worthwhile to take in those early phases of the game. Probably one of the more impactful changes that is coming out of this patch as well, that is pretty much impacting every division almost, is the change to 1 LMG infantry. This is like British Commonwealth Rifle Infantry, Grenadiers on the Axis side, Strelkian Guards on the Soviet side. They have all received increased availability. Previously, they were 9, 18, 27, and now they are up to 12, 24, 36. This is now giving them an actual reason to exist alongside the double LMG units. As you can see, the rifles Piat having 2 Brens is still 9, 18, 27. This makes these lighter infantry that generally didn't have a lot of reason to take unless you had no other options. They're now the numerous ones, and potentially can fill in the gaps of bulking out like armored divisions or other divisions that just need numbers in order to win against the better equipped squads. It's gonna probably make some waves in various divisions, and we'll have to see how it works out. But even just tinkering around with a little bit of deck building, it definitely seems like there are cases where having maybe a card of rifles in a phase to bulk out your numbers is actually could be a legitimate option to go into long games or something like that. It is important to note that the American rifles early and similar American squads did not get this buff, as they have a lot of additional firepower thanks to those entirely semi-automatic M1 Garens, meaning that now the Americans still generally have a firepower advantage in one-to-one engagements, but they do now have fewer numbers than that of the Soviets, Commonwealth, or German divisions if they're using those weaker out squads themselves. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not going to go over every single cost change that can be found. However, I do want to draw attention that the Panzer IV-H and the T-34 1942 variant both did go down 5 points in cost, which might not seem like a big thing, but makes these tanks cheaper and even more cost efficient, which they do kind of need to be, as there has been a lot of power from things like the M4 Sherman, who not only is a very strong medium tank, but also had a lot of machine guns that were very powerful. Now, Panzer IVs and T-34s will generally have a bit more oomph behind them, and overall, it should make a lot of Soviet and Axis divisions just a little bit more cost efficient into like Western Allied divisions that were, being able to overwhelm them with Shermans. The final change that I'm going to talk about in generic terms is that pretty much all of the 37mm AA guns that are found across practically every division in the game have all received an availability boost. So for example, this Soviet 37mm gun now has 4 availability in A, 8 in B, and 12 in C. Now, many divisions will have lost a card of anti-air. However, the fact that you're now able to vet these guns up and have 3 of them still, or even 2 at double vet, is a pretty significant addition. And is overall a pretty nice buff, especially for divisions that are tight on core slots. You can get a lot more of these AA guns out in fewer slots taken up. Now, those are just a handful of what I consider to be sort of the more wide-sweeping changes coming to the game. There's a lot more changes that were still happening, like there were many more availability changes to certain anti-aircraft guns, a lot of artillery and other units got cheaper, or some stuff like that. But I want to go ahead and try to keep this concise, and we're going to go ahead and talk about the more specific divisional changes that are probably more worthwhile to talk about. Now, this is not going to be an extensive list of all the divisions changed, because there's a lot of divisions that got very minor changes, like small availability tweaks to units and whatnot, but let's talk about the ones that maybe got a couple notable changes. Starting out, we have the 9th Guard Cavalry, which got a pretty significant series of changes. The most notable one being to its infantry tab. And 9th Guard Cavalry, now all of their Kazaki are 12 man. This is significant, as pretty much all of their squads previously were about 8 health, or 8 models in total. So this added 4 more units sporting weapons, adding bulk to the squads, and for the most part, these squads are still only 20 points. The Kazaki PPSH notably did go up 5 points, as previously they were 15, but for being such a large squad now, it's overall worth it. This is probably going to be a pretty significant change to the division, and 9th Cavalry is going to be a lot better at just brawling it out infantry-wise, as its infantry are bulky and quite potent. However, that is not the only change. This is another kind of universal change, but certain tanks and recon vehicles have gotten pretty significant price buffs, such as the Valentine 3, which is now a dirt cheap 20 points, making them extremely, extremely cost efficient for what they do. This is a god tier anti-like vehicle option now, because 20 points for a tank that could maybe kill a Panzer 4 or something like that is horrifically good. Even though it's still slow as hell and doesn't have HE shells, probably going to see these a lot, and they're going to do a lot of work. On top of that, the Valentine 9 got a change, which, again, it just essentially got a price decrease, which makes them just even better. But another big thing for 9th Guards specifically is their MCHAs are now available in C. Previously, they were locked to A and B, but now you can take these in C, meaning that if 9th Guard Cavalry really wants to, it can spam MCHAs as a late-game option. On top of this, they got generic changes like the Kazaki PTRS getting a, availability boost for early game. And one more Soviet change that'll be quite generic, but I'll mention here, is that their 85mm AA guns have gotten buffed. Not only did they drop in price, but they also got an availability boost. So now you get 3 or 6 of them. So similar to how the 37mm got buffed, it's a lot easier to just have a ton of anti-aircraft guns, which makes a lot of Soviet divisions and other divisions a lot more capable. And this 85 definitely needed it, as its limited range for its AP shells made it a lot worse than something like the Flak 88 that the Germans had. So this is generally a pretty nice buff to it. But overall, the 9th Guards probably got some pretty nice changes overall. More options to go late game, its infantry is definitely way stronger, and some very potent things like the Valentines and a much better AA tab. Next up, we have the 3rd Guard Tank Corps, who, on top of benefiting from many of the generic Soviet changes, also notably actually got some activation point alterations in terms of deck building. Most notably, it got a decrease in its recon tab, with its last slot being a 2-point instead of 3-point. The last infantry slot went from 4 to 3. However, in trade for this, it did end up losing one of its anti-air slots. So a little bit less anti-air, but you can potentially cram more infantry into this and recon as well. So bit of trade-off, but probably worthwhile overall, because 5 cards of anti-air, especially since 3rd Guards doesn't have a bunch of anti-air that's really great, you can probably cram what you need in those slots. A couple other generic changes I'll draw attention to in this division. The BA-10 got cheaper, which was already a pretty strong recon vehicle, and now it's only 20 points. So similar to the Valentine, this is going to be a really nice vehicle overall. And on top of that, we also have the PE-2 with rockets that have gotten changes. A lot of the rocket planes, at least the bigger rocket planes, have had their availability buff. So you get 2 in A, 4 in B, which just makes them overall more numerous and a bit easier to take compared to, say, like the bomber variant that's now fewer in numbers early in a match. Moving on, we have the 7th Mechanized as another division that has gotten a pretty significant amount of changes to it. Starting out with, the tank tab overall got a bunch of different buffs by pretty much all of its tanks getting either cheaper or larger in availability. The Matilda II, the Su-76I, and the T-34 1942s all got price discounts on them, making them even cheaper and more cost efficient. The Su-76I leader got an availability buff, as did the T-34 leader, meaning that now you get more leaders on these tank cards. The AT tab, the Su-76 got its availability buffed, resulting in it having more of them to run around with, which are good because these are very solid light tank destroyers. You also have the ZIS-3, which I will mention got the same ammo loadout as the Su-76, essentially meaning it has a little bit more APCR in exchange for some different ratios in AP and HE. Overall, a benefit because generally these APCR are pretty useful for killing like heavier tanks that get too close, and you still have a decent amount of HE for indirect fire. Then probably one of the largest changes as well is to the ISU-122, which got an availability buff. Previously, it was 1 in A, 3 in B, and 4 in C, and now it is 2 in A and 4 in B. So this overall just makes them far more numerous and easier to take without having to wait until the late game. On top of that, this is more of a generic buff, but I'll mention it here. The 120mm mortars got an availability buff pretty much across the board. They are now 4, 8, 12, which means that you can get a lot of 120mm mortars if you really want them. It's the same availability as the 81mm mortar pretty much. Now, the 120s didn't get really any other changes than that, at least notable ones, so how impactful these will be, debatable, but I'll mention it here in case you want to. However, that is not the only changes. 7th Mechanized also got availability point changes. Notably, it lost one of its support slots, a 2-cost one, but got the benefit of a AT slot getting one, so it's now easier to load up on AT, as it now has a 2-cost slot. And it also got a 3-point slot reduced to 2, meaning you can now fill out your infantry tab more. Overall, 7th Mechanized was, I believe, already a fairly capable division, and this has essentially just allowed it to front load more of its power, spam out more vehicles, and just generally have more of the good things it has and using it effectively. So probably a pretty good division going forward. Next up, we have a change to the 10th Guard Tank Corps, pretty much, again, benefiting from a lot of the general Soviet buffs, but notably, it got a couple activation slot changes. One of its infantry slots went from a 4-cost down to a 3-cost, and on top of that, it also got a decrease in its support tab with a cheaper 2-cost slot compared to a 3-cost slot. Both of which are fine overall. More infantry is always great, and the Su-122 means you generally need a lot of cheaper support tab slots, so that overall just helps the division. I'll note a couple other buffs here. The Su-57 went down in price again. You also have things like the T-34-85 leader that got cheaper, and the Su-85 also got cheaper itself. Not as many large-scale changes in terms of it, but overall just makes the 10th Guards a little bit more efficient on its own. The 29th Tank Corps is another Soviet armored division that got some AP slot changes. Most notably is the infantry tab. Previously, this was going into 2, 3, 4, 5, and now it's 2, 3, 3, 4. So essentially, it's the last 2 slots got a point cheaper, which is overall nice, since the big thing with 29th has kind of been the fact that its infantry tab gets so expensive that even if you just wanted like a very basic infantry tab, you ended up having to spend a lot of activation points to have it. But now you can pretty much get your standard armored division loadout and be relatively fine. So overall, a nice tiny buff to the division. The 184th got a couple small changes and one new addition, which is this M3 leader card, essentially just being a slightly more combat-capable versions of the Valentine or M3 leaders. The ISU-122 got both a price buff and an availability change. Now you get 3 of these in A and 6 in B. it compared to having, I believe it was 2, 4, 6 in that availability. So now you just get them essentially earlier in numbers. And the final thing, one of the unique units for the 184th, this IL-4 rocket plane with these gigantic rockets, now you get 2 in A and 4 in B, whereas before it was 1, 2, 4 in that order. So overall, very small changes. The generic buffs help it. 184th probably doesn't see drastic shifts, but some of the unique tools or some things you don't see as much got tiny buffs, and that helps the division as it can. Maneuver Group Bezug logo got a couple new additions to it. Most notably is this card of A-19 howitzers in the artillery tab, providing it with a nice little counter battery tool that it previously sort of lacked, having to rely on the Su-76. So that's a nice little addition. On top of that, this PE-2 rocket plane, I believe, got an availability buff of 2 in A and 4 in B, whereas before it was 1, 2. And then on top of that, it also got some availability point changes. Its last infantry slot got a point cheaper, and it also had a new 2-point AT slot added, making it easier to jam in all of these Su-76s, the Panzer Shrek, or this Nashorn if you wanted to. However, in exchange for that, it did lose a artillery slot. So it's going to have a little less room for artillery if you're really trying to spam stuff, but you can still get a pretty deep infantry or artillery tab with it. So not the biggest loss in the world, and overall, it gives a couple more tools to the division. Maneuver Group Viborg got a new recon unit in this T-60 Razvedka, which is also found in the 7th Estonian now. It's essentially just a T-60 with the recon trait, decent little autocannon that previously these two divisions lacked, so can't complain there. On top of that, you also had a price buff to Churchills and the KV-1s on top of all the other changes, just making these slower tanks a bit more cost efficient. Overall, just nice little tweaks, helps the division out a bit, and a new little tank to mess around with and see in-game. Talking about one of the divisions that actually got nerfs, the 2nd Infantry US actually received a handful of nerfs on top of also some changes that essentially didn't happen to its units. In terms of direct nerfs, the Ranger Marauders lost 1 squad in A, which is pretty not that impactful. The more impactful change is instead to their M4 Rhino, which got a price increase up to 90 points, making it fairly expensive for a medium tank, which makes sense since it's very well armored. On top of that, as mentioned previously, its rifle infantry did not get the availability boost of other 1LMG teams, and I didn't realize this, but their Bofors did not get an availability increase either. So the US overall didn't get very many, if any, real buffs, and 2nd Indian technically took a couple small nerfs itself. One American division that did actually get buffs was actually the Big Red One, and these are pretty notable buffs as well. Even though they're only affecting a couple small things, it really does help smooth over the division. These two primary buffs is that the assault leader is now a total of 3 instead of 2, which means you get another bazooka on them, which is very useful since Big Red 1 is very limited on its AT, and probably the biggest change, bazooka teams now can arrive in A, which means that you now have enough close-range AT power to not get instantly run over by like half-treks, which was a big knock against Big Red 1. This probably will boost the division quite a bit. On top of this, the 105mm howitzer got a small price buff, making it 70 points, which, I just feel like mentioning here, but overall, probably just smooths out a weakness of Big Red 1, which is nice to see, because it is an interesting division with its real dip in the middle in terms of armor and whatnot, so an interesting thing overall. Task Force Butler itself also got some new cards or some additional changes to its vehicles. The tank tab got some more leaders available in it. Now the Sherman leader can arrive in B for more availability, and you got these M5 Stuart tanks that are now a leader card as well. But probably the biggest change is the addition of this FFI group in the infantry tab. This allows for potentially a better distribution of infantry, which is something Butler has always kind of like fallen issue to, because you simply never had the ability to run enough double LMG infantry to keep up. Now, this group is not exactly the strongest of those units, but it still does have 2 automatic rifles and is available in A, B, and C. So you do got a little more room to play around with them, and overall, it'll probably give Butler a bit more room to breathe in how it plays and how it sets up its infantry. 6th Airborne got a very small series of changes. Notably, its airborne paras got price decreased from 30 to 25 points, making them overall a lot more cost efficient. And on top of that, a handful of its more elite units, such as Ox and Bucks, notably got the much better Sten Mark V. And based on the patch notes, seemingly the Mark V is intended to be a lot better than the Mark II. So overall, just tiny buffs, but you know, notably cheaper airborne, so they're not all 30 points, is probably pretty nice for any airborne division with the British paras, but 6th Airborne probably benefits the most from it. The Bulgarian Armored Division also got a pretty interesting series of changes, getting a lot of price buffs and other changes that are interesting to think about. Starting out, the Moto Pihota are now the higher availability as many of the 1 LMG squads are, which is notable because it allows them to maybe be worth taking over the regular Pihota, which were previously the go-to because, well, you just get much bigger squads with them. So maybe this is now worth taking in some phase. You also have these Panzer 38s that pretty much got all pushed into Phase A, so now you can just spam more of them in Phase A. These 37mm guns dropped to a mere 10 points, so these are very, very cheap anti-half-track weapons, which can be useful in the right circumstance. The anti-air gun found in this division, the Bulgarian variant, is now cheaper and has that better availability, so can kind of use it as like a Pack 40-esque gun almost, whereas the 88 is still like the superior version, but more expensive. And finally, in the artillery tab, these 75mm guns drop down to 40 points, and the massive 220mm guns got condensed into A and B, so you get more of them early on. Overall, it's probably not going to move the needle too much for the Bulgarians, but a lot of these changes are nice, giving them just some of these lesser used things a bit more value. Overall, you know, it's a fine and nice little series of buffs for them. Moving on, the 9th Infantry for the Romanians has received a handful of changes to it. Notably, you have the addition of more anti-air within this division. Previously, it had this single card, just pretty much 20mm. That was about all it had, and now it at least has 2 cards of 20mm and a single card of these 75mm guns. So having some AA is better than no AA, so that is a modest improvement. On top of that, there is also some of the generic changes like the Panzer IV getting cheaper. This Takam R2 that appears in a couple Romanian divisions got a higher availability, similar to the Su-76. Some of the IRA aircraft have gotten availability buffs, namely the bomber variants. And to round it out, it says in the patch notes that the recruitee are supposed to be 10 points, but they are not in the 9th Infantry. I don't know if this was an oversight or whatnot, but in theory, these should be 10 points, which would make them pretty fantastic because they have this automatic rifle on them. You know, 9th Infantry is kind of a mediocre division anyway, and these changes more or less just kind of made it so you can kind of play this division and not feel awful when the enemy has more than one bomber out, so that's kind of nice to see. Moving over to the Axis side, 5th Panzer has gotten a series of changes on top of some generic buffs to it. In terms of the specific changes, it has received an additional 1-cost recon slot, which means that you can now actually maybe utilize these recon Panthers or Panzer IVs. On top of that, its last infantry slot got 1 point cheaper, but it did lose one anti-air slot in exchange for those. However, these I think are far more useful than more anti-air. Going over some specific changes as well, a lot of light half tracks on the German side have gotten cheaper, like this 250-10 with the Pack 36 on top of it. You have your Ersatztruppen that drop down to 10 points across all divisions, although I don't think there's a lot of value in those. Uh, Also, like the 250, a lot of the 250s that leaders and whatnot can ride in got cheaper, such as this 250-10. The Panzer IV obviously got a price decrease. The Panzer Buch got not only an availability buff in A, but also is now only 10 points. Potentially really good against half tracks, maybe, which, you know, for some divisions might be something. Anti-air got cheaper, a lot of the 20 millimeters did. And then probably one of the more notable changes is the Hummel got a fire rate buff, so it should now have the same fire rate as the Toad 150 millimeter on the German side, which is a nice buff for it. It gets like an extra round per second, which, you know, like, because this sometimes is the only heavier artillery, that's a nice little change. 5th Panzer probably ain't gonna do anything special, but these are like quality of life changes that make it just a tad bit more usable and having a couple more options for itself, so, you know, that's a fine little adjustment. 5th SS Panzer has also received a series of different changes. The most notable change is that an unused 4 AP slot in its anti-air tab has been removed, as now it can't even take 5 cards of anti-air. And in exchange for that, it's gotten a change by getting another 2-cost support slot, essentially making it so you don't have to really dip into this 3 or 4-cost slot, while still getting your grill and your MGs and your flamers and commanders and most of the things you want from a support tab. On top of that, this T-3485 should be 5 points cheaper, but it didn't get it. None of the German ones did, so maybe that'll be fixed in a future patch. And on top of that, the Vesp 105 got an availability change, overall making it so you have 369, but you do have fewer cards of them, which is a fine trade-off in any circumstance. Overall, you know, tiny little adjustments, small quality of life changes for the 5th SS Panzer. It's not going to move the needle for them in any way, but, you know, any changes are generally decent for them. 28th Jagger is a division that got a couple targeted buffs directly on it. The biggest and most notable thing about this division is you now have 3 cards of Pack 40s compared to just having 1 previously. So now you are able to take both A and B cards of Pack 40s, which is just a great addition because Pack 40s are so good. However, I will also note that Jaeger Pioneers got 5 points cheaper, which is nice to see. They're now on par with like regular Pioneers, but the biggest thing is that these Jaegers, due to how many SMGs and MP40s they got, the performance buff should probably make these pretty nasty 20-point infantry that are able to really do some work in closer terrain. Probably not still as good as like the PPSH, but with how often you do use Jaegers, it should overall be a nice little adjustment to 28th. Probably smooths over some of the more rough elements of the division and gives it a nice bump in the modern day. 91st Luftland follows in 28th Jaeger's stride by getting another card of Pack 40s, meaning you at least have 2 cards of them, which is very welcome. On top of that, this also allows us to talk about the Fallschirmjäger buffs. Notably, the Fallschirmjäger ZF went down 5 points. So now they're a lot more reasonable and should still be excellent long-range units, but you can actually like not spend 40 points on one of those squads, which is nice. On top of that, a lot of essentially Butte Panzers have gotten cheaper. This includes like the 35R, the 39H, and the B2. I won't really mention these since they're not going to be the most impactful things out there, but I feel like mentioning it since we're already in Luftland. And then finally, this Fallschirm 81mm mortar ended up receiving a small adjustment of being cheaper, but I still don't think it's worth it because it's such a short-range mortar. But I actually do also need to mention that the Fallschirm mortar, 120mm mortar, which was actually good because of its radio, allowing it to be very accurate, got that availability buff, but also went up a couple points. So, small adjustments, but getting 4 of these in A is honestly really nice. That gives you plenty of indirect if you need it. So, overall, you know, some nice additions specifically to Luftland, and Fallschirmjäger divisions and other, like, ad hoc units with these cheaper armors are benefiting as well. The 352nd itself got a very interesting addition of a Panther A leader, a single one of them to bring an A, which honestly is pretty nice for the division as it allows you to bring your Jagdpanthers in B and C and still have at least one relatively large tank in A. On top of that, it also benefits a lot from the generic French armored buffs that I talked about, with many of its captured tanks just being cheaper. It also got some buffs to its infantry. A lot of its infantry are now very high in availability, like the Grenadiers and whatnot. Stosstrup also got an availability buff, having several more squads available, so you can kind of spam these guys now, and that can be decently effective, especially since they also got MP40 buff, so they're even better. This LEFH-16 did get an availability buff and other changes. I still don't think it's going to be anywhere near good, but I guess in terms of weight of fire, maybe? It probably needs to be even cheaper than this to be worthwhile, because just note, this is like really bad as an artillery piece. But I guess if you want a lot of them, you could use it. And then finally, this HS-129 got a power buff. Notably, it's dealing a bit more damage in terms of its AT weapon, and overall, you know, just some small adjustments to be more capable. It's some small changes in terms of 352nd, but, you know, a little bit cheaper, a little bit more man spam, a bit more armor. Overall, some fine little adjustments for the division. Tarac 559 is next up, and it has received a handful of activation point slot adjustments that are overall pretty nice for the division. First off, this infantry slot right here has gone from 3 points to 2, making it easier to jam tons of infantry into the division. And on top of that, its anti-tank tab got significantly cheaper, going from 234 to 223, meaning the last 2 slots got cheaper. On top of this, on screen, you can see a variety of units that are pretty much unique to this division getting buffed. The BA-10 captured got cheaper, as with the Soviet ones. This Grenadier MG-26 now has higher availability, putting it on par with things like the Shupo, and they're not disheartened. So these are actually potentially fairly solid like units to spam out. Some of their tanks got better availability in the early phases or got cheaper, like with this Panzer 35. And then down here in the bottom, I believe this was another HS-129 AT plane that got buffs in terms of its performance. So overall, for anybody that plays, the like 2 people watching this that play Tarac, big wins for us. But in terms of making this division good, yeah, don't actually play this division. If you want to suffer, play it. But, you know, whenever we get buffs, we're happy with that. Sprung is a division that got a pretty nice change, all things considered. And this is the addition of these SPA 38Rs, which are 80 kilometer per hour transports. You get 32 of them now, which, being 20 kilometers faster than your other transports, allows at least some of your forces to play more like traditional divisions. This is a pretty significant change, as before, Sprung was an aggressive division that just didn't have the ability to go very fast. But now, at least your Gebrigtsjägers and Brandenburgers and a couple other squads are able to go quickly. Notably, however, things like these SS Fallschirmjäger or units like the various Croatians are not able to use those transports. But still, it's a pretty nice adjustment. On top of that, this Chetnik squad, I'll mention, is particularly great now at 20 points for a high availability recon team. Like, that's just a really good 15-man squad. And also, way back at the start of this video, we talked about these Stukas getting availability or resilience buffs, which are very notable for divisions like this. Some other small changes, this 35S is cheaper, and also if you're in the mood for playing a lot of disheartened stuff, the military police, these 4-man ones at least, got an availability buff, so you can take way more of them and use them way more with disheartened troops now. But overall, for Rüsselsprung particularly, those transports are a very nice addition for the early aggression they need. 12th, Tartalet also got its own changes to it that also affect a handful of other of the Hungarian divisions. For specifically the 12th, you have now replaced your regular engineering units with these disheartened ones. However, they are only 15 points and have higher than average availability, which also got buffed this patch. And on top of that, you also have a card of military police that just overall help to corral this now large amount of disheartened troops. There's also been a couple specific buffs, like this ME 210 getting an availability buff of 246 when it before it was an availability of 124. However, you did lose a card of it, so you only get one of these now. On top of that, smaller changes like this 40mm AT gun going down 5 points, the Saba going down 5 points. One thing that kind of sucks that I'll mention here real quick is that the Tartalet Lovej, I'm sorry if I butchered that name, but these guys did not get their curve fixed. They still have this really weird 12, 18, 36. They should really get the availability buff to be like 12, 24, 36. But Tartalet is not a good division. These changes definitely don't fix it by any means, but a little bit more flavor at least, so can't complain. The Finnish divisions got a small handful of adjustments in terms of their capabilities. The Sissi that are found in Raimna got price decreases by 5 points. This Ratsuvaki is now a shock infantry, which it previously wasn't, making them overall, they also got cheaper as well. So now this is potentially a very solid squad. These Jakari leaders did not, or got an availability buff as well, although the leader variant didn't, so seems like that was an oversight. And then also Raimna and the Finnish armored division both got a card of these military police. Even though there's only like a card of disheartened, you know, if you wanted to use it, you could. Overall, not like a ton of changes outside of Raimna now having even more shock infantry alongside their Jakari. So this division just is going to be entirely shock infantry, which, I mean, that is the thing it needs to do in order to win matches. So I guess a fine buff, but I don't play the Finnish a lot, so I can't comment how massive or insignificant they are. And to round out the divisions that I'm going to talk about, the 4th Alpine got a series of pretty much just cost buffs across the board for a variety of units. Its recon infantry got cheaper. Its infantry, the Alpine themselves got the availability buff of 1 LMG units, which makes them pretty solid overall. Their leaders also got cheaper. The tanks either got cheaper, like this command variant, or got more numerous, like this M15. This heavy AA gun not only got cheaper, but got the availability buff, so now it can act as sort of a slightly better Flak 88 almost. Like, it's a little worse with less penetration, but overall it probably has some nice utility. And then some other small buffs like this really tiny howitzer getting a much larger availability. Overall, I don't play a lot of the Italians either, so I can't tell you if this really does a whole lot. Probably not, because the weaknesses of, like, bad armor and whatnot still exist, but you fight a bit better in infantry and have some slightly different tools. So, you know, again, any buffs, you know, are generally welcome. And that is going to bring us to the end of this video. I did not get a chance to talk about nearly everything that is in this patch. There's simply way too much for me to cover. But hopefully that gives you a good idea of everything that is available. On top of that, you know, I didn't even talk about more generic buffs like this Stug 3F that is seen in a bunch of divisions as an AT unit. Got massive buffs, it got cheaper, higher availability, and it has more HE shells. So it's essentially just a Stug with less armor in the tanked in the AT tab. I didn't talk about like certain divisions like how the like Kampfgruppe von Tatau, a bunch of its infantry got buffed, like the walk units getting either cheaper or more numerous, you know, and on and on and on. I could keep going and going, but this video is already going to be quite the long thing, so I just want to wrap it up there. If you have enjoyed today's video or found it useful to kind of get your summary, like and subscribe, because I do occasionally upload Steel Division 2 stuff. I probably will do a video here shortly of the new Hell's Highway divisions, but overall, thank you for watching if you've watched all the way to the end, and I hope you have a good day.